She was small, brown-haired, the baker's daughter. Flour dusted her sleeves. She carried a wicker basket still warm with loaves, and, tucked beside them, a sprig of rosemary the baker's wife insisted would keep the night away. The air smelled of yeast and sweat, and the tar of ship ropes. The city's walls, so often called unbreachable by men who never bled, threw back the murmurs of a crowded evening. Then the ground began to speak differently, not with voices, but with the drumming of hooves over earth and stone. A distant gate screamed on its hinges. The dog that begged at the oven's mouth stopped mid-whine. From the harbor, a wind came thin and cold, as if it had run through iron. She turned toward the sound and saw it, torches cresting like a tide, steel flashes where moonlight found edges, the flutter of green banners. Shouts, a rush of bodies. A hand, not her father's, seized her wrist. The basket fell. Bread broke open on the cobbles. The scent of rosemary could not keep what was coming. Not the wall, not the saints, not the sea. The door opened. The torch moved. She stopped breathing, and tonight, the city would learn what it meant to be taken. She would remember the smallest things, the rope burn on her skin when they bound her, the way the torch smoke tasted, bitter, like old almonds, the rough weave of a soldier's cloak pressed against her cheek as they shoved her into a line. The baker's wife whispered a prayer that cracked in the middle. The girl tried to catch the words, as if a syllable might be a key. She could not. Words were feathers in a flood. "Do not look back," someone said. "If you look back, they pick you first." It was not a threat. It was an inheritance passed from mouth to mouth like a coin with the king's face worn smooth. They crowded near the Templar fortress at the water's edge. Men argued. Emissaries crossed a courtyard with their hands raised, the way men do when they think paper can stop steel. A promise was offered in Low Arabic and High French. The promise was for women and children. The promise had the shape of mercy. Promises turned to ash when doors open. The girl watched a rider dismount. Boots crushed rosemary. A horse snorted steam into the cold. The lanterns, so faithful a moment before, flickered. That was all. Just a flicker. Let me tell you about the men who came down the coast in armored waves and called themselves Mamluk. Owned. They were not a rumor. They were a system. Before I reveal what happened to her, you need to understand who commanded the night. Now we need to go back to the mid-13th century, to a world where thrones were made not by birth but by purchase, discipline, and war. The Mamluk Sultanate, forged in 1250 out of the Ayyubid inheritance, ruled Egypt and Syria until the Ottomans buried its crown in 1517. Slave soldiers, bought as boys from the steppes and the Caucasus, drilled to obedience, raised on the logic of the barracks, became lords of a realm that outlived their own names. Cairo was the capital, a city of minarets and markets where copper bowls sang under the hammer and pigeons circled above domes the color of sand after rain. Inside its citadel, sultans received embassies and sent letters that traveled faster than forgiveness. Their law was a tapestry of jurists and judges, but their power was simpler. They held the roads, the ports, the tax registers, the armies, and the gates to the holy cities. To understand this, we must look at the world they inherited. Crusader polities, stitched along the Levantine coast, had become fragile bones around which trade and enmity both clung. Antioch, Tripoli, the last strongholds, once bright with Latin banners, were shadows at noon. In May 1268, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars took Antioch and, in letters whose ink still bites the page, boasted of thousands slain and tens of thousands led away. Contemporary chroniclers called the sack the single greatest massacre of the entire crusading era. In 1291, they turned their full attention to Acre, the pillar that held up a crumbling sky. The final days were bargaining in the teeth of a storm, talks of amnesty for the weak, safe conduct for women and children, time to flee by sea. But negotiations are only as good as the hands holding the swords. When the fortress fell, mercy did not. Even sympathetic histories speak of an appalling massacre. Inside Egypt, Christians and Jews, dhimmis under Islamic law, were tolerated, taxed, regulated, and watched. In anxious seasons, rulers tightened the noose of identity. Edicts required distinctive dress: blue turbans for Christians, yellow for Jews. Women of each community marked as tradition demanded. Under such rules, a crowd could know you before you spoke. The order could change with the wind. The humiliation did not. And beneath the public world, another world, the market of bodies. The Mamluk order relied on slavery, military for men, domestic for women. In law and practice, a master had sexual access to his female slaves. Children born of those unions carried the stamp of their mother's status until manumission or grace altered the ledger. Cairo's homes were full of women who did not choose their door. Their stories leak into court records, poems, and jurists' arguments like water through a cracked wall. Pan across the bazaar. The noise is beautiful. The silence underneath it is policy. Let me tell you how it began to swell, how victories on the coast filled ships with prisoners, how the ships turned toward Alexandria and Damietta, and how victory's harvest arrived to be sorted like cargo. In 1426, the Sultan Barzbey's fleet crushed Cyprus at Khoirakhoidia. Captives were paraded in Cairo, a tributary king bowed in chains. In the crowd's cheers, you can hear the metallic ring of a market bell. This is where everything changed. Not in law books, but in rooms. Not in proclamations, but in hands. Because what came next was worse. The men who gave the orders did not begin as princes. Baybars, Kalawun, Al-Nasir Muhammad, names cut into stone, were once boys with foreign tongues, sold into a machine that refashioned them into generals. Imagine a childhood of drills at dawn, of oaths repeated until breath and promise were the same thing. Imagine learning that love is a word that means loyalty up the chain and obedience down it. Long sentences of discipline, short lessons of fear. Baybars believed that a state could be held together by speed. He moved like a knife through cloth, north to Antioch, east to face the Mongols, south to the Red Sea routes. He hunted allies with gifts and hunted enemies with letters sharpened into threats. He believed himself a sort of god. Enough victories agreed. Kalawun, the builder, stitched succession and bureaucracy into a living skin. He married alliances to blood and fortified cities with stone. His son, Al-Ashraf Khalil, finished the work at Acre. The sea was crowded with refugees. The shore was crowded with corpses. A long campaign ended in a short verdict. They ruled by rivalry. Each sultan watched his emirs the way a hawk watches. Mice, knowing a feast and a betrayal, smell the same at first. Family was an instrument played carefully because a nephew could be a conspirator, a son an assassin, a wife a faction with a heartbeat. The Mamluk palace was a ladder. Every rung was greased. A man could rise from the stable to the throne. He could fall from the throne to an unmarked ditch. As the 14th century wore on, the Circassian Mamluks supplanted their Turkish predecessors. Power changed hands like a cup at a banquet, swiftly, sometimes spilling. Yet the logic persisted. Armies must be fed and paid. Cities must be watched. Outsiders must be kept outside unless profit demanded otherwise. Victories on the frontier produced markets in the capital. Markets produced loyalty. Loyalty produced more victories. He believed that order required fear. The empire agreed. Between campaigns, the sultans cultivated a moral theater. Processions for feast days. Punishments in public squares. Sermons that braided divine sanction to policy. Jurists inscribed limits and permissions in elegant Arabic, and those words traveled into homes as footsteps do. Quietly at first, then all at once. They wanted a society that ran on categories: believer, unbeliever, free-owned, soldier, civilian, man, woman, master, servant. Categories do not have hearts. People do. They waited for morning. They waited for God. They waited for orders. But that was only the beginning. Power must explain itself. The Mamluk explanation was simple. God gives rule to whom he wills. Rulers defend the faithful. The faithful obey to keep the world from falling apart. The rest is accountancy. Taxes were the empire's pulse. Jizya, customs duties, land assessments, numbers written on palimpsests of conquest. In hard years, pressure climbed. When plague and famine clawed at the Nile Valley, minorities became arithmetic solutions. Seize an endowment here, close a church there, demand a color on a head, make difference visible, make it manageable. Inside homes, control wore another face. A female slave could be a nurse, a maid, a singer, a concubine. In contracts and court, she was property. In rooms, she was a person who learned to fold herself into surviving shapes. The law recognized the category walad, mother of a child, for a slave who bore her master's son. Her status improved, but the beginning of that improvement was a night she did not choose. Neighbors learned to lower their eyes. Priests learned to count quietly. Merchants learned that bribes are a language. Christian communities, Copts in Egypt, Melkites and Maronites in Syria, Latins where they still clung, bent without breaking, then bent again. The empire could be tolerant by habit, harsh by policy, cruel by impulse, all in the same month. A switch, a nod, a riot, a decree, pan across a court record. A judge lists garments a Christian must not wear. A fine, a confiscation. A man nods humiliated. The scribe sands the wet ink. The page dries. The story doesn't. Power demanded silence. Power demanded obedience. Power demanded daughters. And when war sent captives to Cairo, the city absorbed them with a practiced appetite. Traders evaluated age, language, skill, beauty, price. Flesh was read the way scribes read manuscripts, carefully for what it might yield. A girl could be renamed, reclothed, remade. A woman could be placed in a house where the doors had many keys but none in her hand. The empire told itself a story about order, discipline, and God's will. The women learned the story's cost, because what came next was worse. Return to the quay at Acre. She is there again in the mind that keeps returning. She has no name we can recover, so call her what her father called her, little one. The torches are closer. The gate has opened. The line is moving. She does not scream when the blade flashes. She cannot. Sound has narrowed to the bell of her own heart. She sees a horse's flank so close the hair is a map of rivers. A soldier's hand looms and she flinches. It only takes the ribbon from her braid. It drops to the mud like a vein. Women and children first, someone says, as if kindness still applies. She does not yet know that words can mean their opposite. Later she will. Even the chronicles hint. Amnesty's promised. Amnesty's betrayed. Chaos is a better negotiator than mercy. They move her with others through streets she recognizes, made suddenly foreign by fear. Past the spice stalls where the cinnamon smells thick and sweet. Past the baker's door where the ovens still glow. Past a church where the priest is packing the chalice as if he could carry holiness to sea. At the harbor, a ship groans. Men press toward it and the press becomes a crush. The girl's feet leave the ground for a breath. When they return, they are not where they were. She stares at the water. It looks like a road. It is not. The door opened. The torch moved. She stopped breathing. When morning breaks, not light, but the shift in sound when most screams have become sobs, she is counted. Counted again, placed under guard. Given water in a cracked bowl that tastes of salt and tin. A man with a ledger marks a line. He does not look at faces. He is paid to look at numbers. Days become a sea without waves. She is loaded onto a ship with other captives, and the coast thins into a line like thread. A sailor sings while he coils rope. The song is not for them. It is for the ship. In Alexandria, the harbor stinks of fish and victory. Porters shout. A procession of prisoners shuffles inland. Cairo waits behind the desert like a mouth. The city's alleys receive them. The courtyards swallow them. Market, bargain, seal. A door closes. A life narrows. Her new home is not a palace. It is a merchant's house with a painted ceiling and a courtyard fountain whose water is colder than the kindness in the voices that give her orders. She learns the names of jars, sumac, sesame, vinegar. She learns to carry a tray at the exact height that says invisible. She learns to sleep without dreaming, because dreaming makes crying, and crying has a price. The wife of the house watches her like a hawk. The master of the house does not watch. He waits. Waiting is its own language. On one night, when the moon is a thin coin, the waiting ends. No one asks her a question because there is no question to ask. She stares at the latticework above the bed so hard that for days afterward the pattern remains when she closes her eyes. They waited for morning. They waited for God. They waited for death. She does not die. That is the point. She lives into the category the law has for her. Perhaps a mulad if a child comes. Perhaps not. Either way, the mornings begin again. In the courtyard, a goldfinch sings and the sound hurts. The scent of iron and ash clings to her hands from the brazier. The cook jokes about prices in the market. A neighbor's baby wails. Life, like an empire, continues. She meets others in the house's shadowed geography. An older woman from the Black Sea coast who teaches her to strong back a water jar without bruising. A girl from Cyprus who arrived the year the Sultan paraded prisoners through Cairo and the crowd cheered until their mouths were dry. They speak to one another in whispers that braid 3 languages and still miss something essential. Before I reveal what happened, she says once, but she does not finish. Some stories do not survive the telling. Some stories survive by not being told. Pan across the hall. The bodies blur. On a feast day, the household goes out to see a procession. Drums pulse. Standards glow. A jurist rides by, grave as a ledger. Someone says the Sultan is a just man. Someone else nods the way a person nods when nodding is safer than speaking. A preacher's voice floats. God favors order. Order favors the ruler. The ruler favors the obedient. The girl does not look up. She knows what obedience buys. One winter, a clerical edict spreads through the lanes. Christians to wear blue turbans, Jews yellow. Let distinction keep the world in its proper columns. She is not allowed a turban, only a scarf of a certain weave. She ties it carefully. She ties it so tightly a headache blooms. She says nothing. In the spring, a child is born in the house, not hers. She carries the child sometimes and feels the small heartbeat against her wrist, like a bird inside its shell. Her own body is late that month. Then late again, she watches the sky for an omen. There is none. Months gather. A midwife comes, thin as a reed and twice as flexible. The room smells of myrrh, old sweat, and the metal of fear. A cry splits the air and the midwife smiles the way a woman smiles when she has steered life past the rocks. The house celebrates. The master's hand rests on the newborn's head. The mother's eyes shine with complicated light. The girl watches from the doorway and knows without being told what she has become. The law has a name for it. Her heart has another. The door opened. The torch moved. She stopped breathing. Her story is not recorded, but the silence that follows is. Histories remember what empires do. They remember the dates that fit on coins. 1268 Antioch, 1291 Acre, 1426 Cyprus. They remember names that can be carved. Baybars, Kalawun, Bars Bay. They remember treaties that turned kings into tributaries, parades that turned captives into theater. They remember that the Mamluks stood like a wall against the Mongols, shone like a lantern of learning. and then fell in 2 Ottoman blows. They do not remember her. The baker's daughter, and the Cypriot girl by the fountain, and the Black Sea woman with the strong back, left marks without signatures. A child's face that looks a little like the master's. A hymn sung softly in a kitchen when no one listens. A roll of cloth paid for with wages that were not wages at all. When the plague came, it took masters and servants the same, but it wrote the ledger in different ink. When famine came, it tightened belts at the top and throats at the bottom. When new sultans ousted old ones, the walls of the houses did not move, only the rules inside them. A change of dynasty changes uniforms first. The rooms take longer. Generations later, a chronicler would note an edict about dress, or a riot after a rumor, or a confiscation of a church endowment. Ink dries quickly. Bruises take longer. The Mamluk edifice cracked under gunpowder and debts. The Ottomans swept in. Cairo bowed and then stood up to greet its next master with the same practiced courtesy. Some slave soldiers became provincial notables. Some died unspectacularly. The houses kept their courtyards, their fountains, their latticed rooms. The market's bell still rang. The city forgot and remembered itself by turns. What happened to her? Perhaps she died in childbirth and the house gave her a private grief because grief is cheaper than a monument. Perhaps she lived to see her son freed and then watched him greet her in the street with the careful politeness a free man owes a woman who made his freedom possible. Perhaps she taught a younger girl how to avoid bruises and how to hide a coin in a hymn. Perhaps all of these at once. Her name is missing. Her fate is common. Her absence is the most accurate record we have. What happened next turned fear into legend. Let me tell you about the quiet arithmetic of power. About how an empire can be brilliant in art, precise in administration, resplendent in ceremony, yet build rooms where a person becomes a category. About how a law code can polish words until they shine and still be used to dim a life. How do we judge a civilization that sanctified cruelty and catalogued it with beautiful handwriting? How do we look at a city that welcomed scholars and caravans, then counted prisoners the way it counted bales of pepper? How do we speak honestly about an age that crushed Antioch and Acre and still carved poetry into stone? We begin, perhaps, by refusing to forget the rooms. We can praise what was luminous, architecture, scholarship, courage in the face of invading empires, and still attend to the shadow those lights cast. We can admit that slavery was not an aberration, but a system, and that systems have human faces. We can recognize that worse than death is not a phrase meant to inflame, but a truth spoken by those who survived the narrowest corridors of survival. Power demanded silence. We do not owe it. Before we leave, understand this. Nothing in this story is safely passed. Every age writes new categories and asks old obediences. Every city decides how loudly it will hear the whispers behind its doors. Subscribe now, because what you're about to hear, again and again in other places with other names, reveals how power destroys those who can't resist it. Pan across the hall. The bodies blur. The faces come into focus. Now we go back to the key, because endings are only honest when they return to the beginning. The lanterns sway. The bread breaks on the stones. A girl looks up as the torches gather, and for a breath, she believes the promise that mercy is a door. She was only 13. And the empire called it divine.